Unitarian Julia Ward Howe is best known today as the author of the lyrics of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. It was a song meant to spur on the Union troops at the end of the Civil War. But in her day, Julia Ward Howe was best known for her work to end slavery, her work for international peace, and her work to secure the right of women to vote. She organized the first gathering of Unitarian women ministers, the first convention, and she was the first woman elected to the American Academy of Arts and Letters. She was also the founder of Mother's Peace Day, an anti-war event which eventually was turned into the Mother's Day that we know. In her original proclamation, Howe wrote, "As men have forsaken the plow and the anvil at the summons of war, let women now leave all that may be left of home for a great and earnest day of council, to promote the great and general interests of peace." For Howe, Mother's Day wasn't about cards and flowers and brunches, nice as those can be. It was about honoring the important perspective and voices of women. Perspectives and voices that are so often ignored or discouraged and discounted as they were in her marriage. This Mother's Day, I am of course glad to celebrate all of you who mother, all of you who are mothers. Happy Mother's Day. However, in this transformative, pandemic-suspended time, my thoughts this morning turn to the root of Julia Ward Howe's Mother's Day, beneath the anti-war focus even, to the importance of the voices and perspectives and leadership of women if we're going to move into a future that is more life-sustaining. Now I want to acknowledge up front the narrowness of that male-female binary. Not everyone considers himself male or female, and that's limiting. And I want to acknowledge up front that here I am, a male-identified person, talking about listening to the voices of women. I'll come back to that dissonance later. I've been meeting with a group of almost all women to plan an event in August honoring the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment that granted all American women citizens the right to vote. It is the vision of Nevada City Mayor Renette Seenum, whose hope has been that this community might learn more of the untold stories, the hidden stories, the painful stories, including the stories related to racism around the entire suffrage movement. And her vision, her hope is that the community draw on that learning to envision a sustaining future for Nevada County into the next 100 years. What can we learn from our past? In the late 1800s, Nevada City resident Ellen Clark Sargent was treasurer of the National Woman Suffrage Association and a close friend of Susan B. Anthony, after whom our library at UUCM is named. With Ellen's urging, her husband Aaron, a U.S. Senator in 1878, proposed a constitutional amendment giving women the right to vote. As you know, that amendment did not pass in 1878. However, it was reintroduced every year for the next 40 years, until in the midst of the worst pandemic of that century, the worst on this continent since the smallpox epidemic that destroyed the lives of so many Native people. It was then, in 1920, that it took hold and was enacted as the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Our group started last fall planning a big 3-day interactive event at Miners Foundry for this amendment's anniversary coming in August. And then the coronavirus arrived. In our conversations afterward, we navigated not only all the sudden changes needed in our planning, but also our personal unfolding reactions to the pandemic. We spoke of our personal fears, of the dangers, of the likely hardships ahead. We also spoke of the potential transformation that could come from our world being shaken drastically enough to really change things. We spoke of opportunities opened by the upheaval to find truly new ways forward. We spoke of the vital importance of the vision, the knowledge, the skill, and the leadership of women in finding a new path forward and in avoiding a return to business as usual. In the process, we became more clear about the focus for this now online event. An event that draws on local and national history to lift up the voices and the perspectives of women, including women marginalized in other ways, as we look for a path into a future that is more compassionate, more sustainable, more just, to put it in the language of the mission of this congregation. More information to come about that event, but today it inspires me to lift up a few of the known influences of women on our Unitarian Universalist history, some of the mothers of our tradition. Judith Sargent Murray, for example, an early Universalist on this continent, essayist, poet, writer of likely the first play by any American author to be produced on stage. And with her essay on the equality of the sexes, in 1790, the first published American advocate for women's rights. Advancing the notion of Republican motherhood, she argued very shrewdly that the success of the new nation required intelligent citizens, and since the education of patriotic sons rested with mothers, women should be educated. She educated her own daughter at home and helped open a female academy south of Boston in 1802. Her lifelong advocacy of women's rights aligned with her universalism, which claimed that if God loved everyone absolutely, who are we to see anyone as excluded or anyone as higher or lower than anyone else? Whether or not we hold a belief in God or divinity, it's a value to which we Unitarian Universalists still aspire and toward which we work to this day. You've likely never heard of Sarah Alden Bradford Ripley. Born 3 years after Murray's essay on the equality of the sexes was published. Sarah, a scholar, did not leave writings behind or found institutions. Instead, she quietly influenced a generation of coming transcendentalists who did. Sarah taught and tutored and otherwise ran the household for the students at the boarding school run by her husband. Students like young Ralph Waldo Emerson, whose views later shaped not only Unitarianism, but American culture in general. Emerson and his friends vied for a place around her kitchen table to seek her wisdom, her knowledge, her counsel, as well as her food. Emerson wrote, "Talk on what you will, she can always give you a new idea. Ask her any philosophical question, she will always enlighten you by her answer." Sarah embodied the explicit use of reason that came to characterize Unitarianism. The use of reason no matter where it leads. Ralph Waldo's aunt, Mary Moody Emerson, who had taken Sarah under her wing when Sarah was young, she saw Sarah as the cause of a source of Ralph Waldo Emerson's downfall, and it became what known as transcendentalism. And that's the level of the effect she saw that Sarah had on young Ralph Waldo Emerson. Sarah Alden Bradford Ripley is an example of who knows how many women we will never know. Women denied the opportunity of professorships and ministries, who quietly channeled their scholarship toward women and men who we do know and remember. 70 years after Sarah Alden Bradford Ripley was born, in 1863, Universalist Olympia Brown became one of the very first women ordained as clergy with the consent of her denomination. Consent that was denied her at first. Just 12 years after Olympia's ordination, Julia Ward Howe was organizing that women's ministerial conference, and 21 Unitarian women formed the Iowa Sisterhood, a group to support each other as they served churches throughout the Midwest and the Plains states. They took the hard jobs out on the rough and tumble frontier, a prospect that scared off most of the men ministers from the East. Not only did these women serve, they changed the nature of church in America. Not only did they found successful and rapidly growing congregations, they changed how church was done. They moved it from a place where one heard liberal religious ideas to a sense of church that provided comfort, hospitality, community, education, cultural enrichment, and social service. Caroline Bartlett Crane, for example, built a huge new church building in Kalamazoo, Michigan. But instead of looking like a church, she had a building built that looked like a very large home. She changed the congregation's name to People's Church, which is still that congregation's name. Caroline wrote, "This church cannot be a place where we are merely to come together once a week and enjoy our doctrine and congratulate ourselves that we have a faith free from superstition. We must do something for others as well as for ourselves. And the more we have done for others, the more in the end we shall find we have done for ourselves." These women held classes in reading, writing, sewing, finances, home economics, cooking. They put classrooms in their church buildings and parlors with fireplaces. They attended to the entire life of their congregants, their members, not just their theological ideas and ideologies. You still see their influence in many Protestant churches to this day. But by the turn of the century, as those areas of the nation became more developed and appealing, and the nation had this rising concern to bring back, they thought, more masculine leadership in the nation, the men who held power in the institutions of the East withdrew their support from these women ministers and effectively pushed them out of their ministerial roles and into retirement, or more often into public roles where they served the wider community. 130 Universalist and Unitarian women were eventually ordained around that time. But by 1960, there were no Unitarian women ministers, and only 3 women ministers serving Universalist congregations. That was the reality just 1 year before the 1961 merger of the Universalist Church of America and the American Unitarian Association to become the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations, our association. This Tuesday marks the 59th anniversary of that merger, a merger for which Universalists and Unitarians had to hammer out a set of principles that would be acceptable enough to people from both groups. Those original principles referred to the dignity of man, ideals of brotherhood, and men of goodwill. So, in the late 1970s, in the midst of second wave feminism, Unitarian Universalist women strategized about how to eradicate the sexism from their own religion, how to affirm women, and how to show respect for the earth while they were at it. That effort led to a 1985 rewrite of the Unitarian Universalist Association Purposes and Principles, the addition of a 7th principle, respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part, and a push to update the hymn book and its sexist language. So at the beginning of that wave, in 1972, there were about a couple dozen women ministers. Just 6 years later, the numbers had doubled. So in 1978, there were 57 women ministers, 6% of the ministers in our denomination, in our association. When I first joined Unitarian Universalist congregation, just 11 years or so after that, the number was already up to 25%. There were 276 women ministers. And just 10 years after that, in 1999, women outnumbered men. In fact, it made the front page of the New York Times. The Unitarian Universalist Association became the first Protestant denomination in history in which congregations employed more female than male clergy in their leadership. With those women ministers came more focus on shared ministry and collaboration, room for more varied senses of spirituality, more personal openness, a focus on relationships and connecting. They opened the way for gay and lesbian ministers, and eventually transgender, queer, and gender nonconforming ministers. And 3 years ago, Susan Frederick Gray became the first woman president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, a milestone guaranteed by the nominating committee's commitment to force Unitarian Universalism across this threshold. They did it by nominating only women. Since then, women and gender non-conforming persons have led the way in our association's long overdue effort to decenter whiteness and to center the voices of Black persons, Indigenous persons, other people of color, and other historically marginalized people. So, with that quick and very little bit of Unitarian Universalist herstory in mind and heart, on this Mother's Day I ask, what does it mean? And where is it leading? Well, this is a much larger conversation, but I want to plant the seed for it today. One of the messages I take from our history, as we find ourselves suspended in the significant disruption of this moment, more and more aware of the enormous and growing disparities in wealth and power, and the destruction of our environment, is that if we want to find our way into a future that is meaningfully different from and better for more people than our past, a future that is genuinely more compassionate, more sustainable, more just, it is women who can best lead the way. Women, particularly marginalized women, and others who have been held out at the margins of society and power. We who have power, we men, by virtue of the power we've been granted, cannot help as leaders, but in subtle ways to feed a slide toward business as usual, no matter how progressive and well-intentioned we are. It's similar to what we're learning about what it means to be white in a culture that privileges and prioritizes whiteness. Even when we're trying not to, our behaviors often support and shore up the status quo. Now, I know this is a tough pill for men to swallow. You might ask, wouldn't equal leadership be the true ideal, our vision of beloved community? Not either or, but both and. Wouldn't it be helpful to be gender blind? Well, in theory, yes, eventually. That is the ideal. But to get there from here, to shift things, to avail ourselves of the opportunities at this particular threshold, it's going to take some correction. And I believe that the role for us cisgender men whose bodies match our gender identity, the role for us men at this point in humanity's journey is to learn to stay in the room and be willing to be led. I've been thinking about this over the past couple years as I've watched my white male colleagues, especially of a certain age, struggle with a sense of feeling lost as our association seeks to decenter whiteness and traditional holders of power. In other words, to decenter white men. As women have become the large majority of our seminarians and our ministers. We men have been encouraged and trained to lead from front and center, and to do good in the world from that location. When we're not front and center, we're not quite sure what to do. I'm watching my colleagues, many of whom deeply support the decentering of whiteness and of maleness, decide that their job then must be to get out of the way, to be helpful by leaving the room and making room for a new set of leaders. But when we white men leave the room entirely, we take our power out with us, withdrawing it as a resource that could serve and support those new leaders. I believe that our job as men and as white people is to learn to stay in the room and be willing to be led by others. To be led by others and their vision for the future. Otherwise, I believe, very little will really change. Now, I'm still figuring out what this means and looks like for me. And as I want to say, stay tuned. The Mother's Day that we know, lovely and loving as it is, bolsters the traditional roles and places of women and men in our society. Julia Ward Howe had a vision for a Mother's Day of women's perspectives turning the status quo on its head. Many Unitarian Universalist and Unitarian Universalist women, including many of you I know, had held hope for similar possibilities. This Mother's Day, the disrupted state of the world may be opening up a rare opportunity. May we answer the opportunity of this moment, each in our own way, knowing that what we introduce now might not get ratified for another 40 or 50 years. Know that it is nonetheless the important and right thing to do. So may we be. Amen.